So I'm going to be talking to you this morning about the crisis in creative effectiveness and what we can do about it. My presentation today, and indeed my book, Lemon, which you may have heard of, is really both, it offers a diagnosis but also a cure. And it also serves as a warning as to what happens when a certain way of attending to the world, a certain mode of thinking becomes too dominant in society, in business, and in advertising. So the last 20 years or so have seen tremendous change in business, in technology, of course, but also an urge towards standardization, centralization, and specialization. And these urges and the way of thinking that sort of sits behind them leave inevitable traces in culture today, as they did in the early Roman Empire. Now, go with me on this, everyone. So, the late Roman Empire, 3rd century AD, was a tumultuous time for Rome. The Roman Empire was being attacked on all sides, and emperors came and went with alarming frequency of being usurped and replaced, until Emperor Diocletian came along. And Emperor Diocletian did a number of things. He set up a symmetrical power base in West and Eastern Europe with an emperor on each side, each with a Caesar at each of their sides, and he regimented society. He regimented it and he categorized people into roles. He actually fixed them into their professions. They couldn't leave their professions. So he introduced a kind of specialism. But he also, in perhaps the world's first ever rate card, fixed prices across the Roman Empire. And the effects on culture, on art, on sculpture, as I'm going to show you, were absolutely dramatic. So this is a bust from the period immediately before Diocletian. And here you can see a man caught in a moment, looking upwards. Look at the folds on his skin, the scar on his cheek, the stubble, the stubble on his beard. Look at the folds in his tunic. This is a naturalistic depiction of someone. We're left asking the question, I wonder what he's thinking. I wonder what's going through his mind. Now this gives way to a completely different style in just a space of a couple of generations. So busts start to look like this. Flattened, symmetrical, devitalized, more an evocation, really more of a death mask actually than an evocation of the living. Not just in busts, but also in architecture. So much like today, this was a time when there was a focus on the internal space, on the light that comes in, on large expanses of plain wall. And we move from this naturalistic depiction of nature with its flow and its depth and its slight asymmetry towards something very flat and symmetrical, and that has signs and symbols. Here the cross intertwined by the vine. We move from naturalistic depictions of people caught in a moment with a sense of betweenness here in this lovely mosaic, the sense of depth, a sense of contrast, and we move towards this, a flatness in this image of Christ, unilateral communication, me at you, signs and symbols start to emerge. And we move from compositions, organic, naturalistic compositions of people touching each other, talking to each other, caught in a moment, looking at each other, towards this kind of thing. Flatness, devitalization, and symbolism in the wreaths, in the palms, and in the letters and the words that start to appear. No sense of betweenness, no sense of connection between people. That wouldn't happen today, though, would it? Surely not. Well, it is happening today, very clearly, and it's all around us in advertising. And in culture, actually, there's a loss of sense of betweenness, there is a rectilinearity, there is a flatness, there is a devitalization occurring in communications around us, and indeed in television programming and culture more broadly. Now, why is this? Well, it's all to do with the way that the brain works. And there's some fantastic new work that's been conducted by Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who's written a book called The Master and His Emissary. And it talks about the way the two hemispheres work. The two hemispheres are very different structurally and in the way that they respond to drugs and to hormones. So the left hemisphere prioritizes information in sort of localized brain regions, whereas the right hemisphere has much greater dendritic overlap, so more branching, if you like. And the right hemisphere has more white matter relative to the grey matter. And that white matter, myelin, is more likely to help conductance. It means things are connected faster between different regions of the brain. So these two halves of the brain are really quite different in structure, and they're different in the way that they attend to the world. It's long been held, and actually it's been rubbished and dismissed, and that the two halves of the brain, do different things. It's not so much that they do different things, as is so popular in this idea in popular culture. It's that they do things differently. They have different priorities. They have different takes on the world. And you see it not just in people, but you see it in other mammals, and you see it in birds. You even see it in worms and insects, that these two hemispheres have different ways of looking at the world. So let me talk to you about birds for a moment, because it's absolutely fascinating and very helpful for explaining differences in people too. So in birds, the left brain, which controls the right half of the body, has a very narrow and goal-orientated focus. So it will look around for things on the ground, grains, food, and it will abstract them from their context, and it will categorize them, and it will identify them and know what to eat. All the while, the right brain, controlling the left-hand side of the body, will be looking around it. It's broad and vigilant in its focus, making sure that it doesn't become someone else's prey. So these two modes of attention are really quite different. The left brain, in people and in mammals, is narrow and it's goal-orientated. It likes to abstract things from their context, and it likes to break things down into ever smaller parts. It loves to categorize things. It's very explicit, so it doesn't like ambiguity at all. It likes things to be very clear. It deals in linear cause and effect. It likes things to be repeatable because it likes things that are familiar. It's very literal, it is very factual, and it's rather self-absorbed, a bit dogmatic, and has an unfounded sense of optimism. Now, I may be describing people you know, I don't know. But anyway, language, signs and symbols, all of these things reside in the left hemisphere. Important aspects of language are involved in the right, but language principally as a communication tool is the left brain thing. And then, because the right brain, the left brain cannot really understand, as I'll come on to say, sort of time and space, the only thing that it really can do when it comes to music is understand sort of a very basic sense of rhythm. So these are left brain priorities, if you like, ways of attending to the world. The right brain, on the other hand, as McGilchrist shows through split brain patients, people who've had lesions, all sorts of ways of looking at how the brain works, is broad and vigilant. It understands the world as it really is. It understands the full context of things. It understands the whole. If the left brain likes tools to manipulate the world, the principle of these is language, and it likes things, the right brain empathizes. It understands people. It understands implicit communication between people. It understands the world, in fact, as a whole, as connection, a set of connections and relationships. And because it's broad and vigilant in its attention, it's open to novelty. It's open, therefore, to contradiction. And because it's open to contradiction and can see two things from the same perspective, from different perspectives, it understands metaphor and it understands humor. And it's very self-aware and very questioning of the world and aware of its time and place in it. It's what's responsible for our sense of lived time. It helps us to understand space, and it helps us to understand depth. And all of these things are important. Visual depth is the equivalent of oral harmony, so harmony and music are very much things that are enjoyed and appreciated by the right brain. So if I were to show you what happens when you get the right brain to draw a flower, there are ways of isolating each half of the brain. So if you just get the right brain to draw a flower, you get something like this. So a sense of the whole, the flower as it really is in the real world. With depth, you get the flower head, but you also get the stem and you get the leaves and a sense of, the way the flower head's tilted there, a sense of depth in this flower. Now, in the same people, I'm going to show you, in rows, you isolate the left brain. You get the left brain to do the same task, and you get this: flattened, abstracted, representations of a flower, not the flower as it really is. So you get a very different view of the world. And whereas the right brain, sees things as they really are, the left brain likes to represent it, to create mental models of the world with which to manipulate the world. And what we really need for great creative leaps is the whole brain. We need both brains working in tandem. So if you wanted to see what everyday objects look like, that as the left brain sees them, they look like this. Flattened, abstracted, devitalized. Look at the people images here. No heads, bits of things, abstracted from the real world. So, what Ian McGilchrist says is that at different times in history, you see a swing towards the left brain. In people, you see it in societies, you see it in business today, and you see it certainly in advertising. And the reason for this is that the corpus callosum, which is the thing that bridges the two halves of the brain, the thing in the middle peeled back here, it bridges the two halves of the brain, but it also acts principally as an inhibitor. One brain can inhibit the other. And the left brain has a greater suppressive effect on the right than the right does on the left. And at certain times in history and in people, as I say, you get this sort of left brain running away with itself and becoming rather too powerful, too dominant. So what I'm going to do is to show you through a series of paintings and through art how this manifests itself in culture through the years. And this will be really helpful when it comes on to looking at advertising. So I'm going to start with this medieval painting. Now, that flatness that emerged in the late Roman period lasted for 1,000 years, and we're towards the end of that 1,000 years in this painting. What you'll notice here is that there is no real sense of perspective. There's a sort of God's eye view of this. And the big people are not closer to us, and the little people aren't further away. They're actually big because they're important and little because they're less important. And that's one of the things about the left brain. It's very obsessed with power and control. And so, it looks very much like, actually, an organogram of today. So big, important, little less important. But then you get this wonderful thing that happens in the Renaissance, and you start to see depth emerge for the first time in 1,000 years in 15th century Florence. And we move towards a kind of whole brain view of the world again. Look at this painting. A number of important things to point out. First, the sense of betweenness in the people who are portrayed. You get a sense of depth. You get a sense of height. You also get flow in the people behind. You get the shepherds here on the right. Actually, that's a reference to a painting 10 years before. This is the artist himself pointing to Christ in the foreground. And you get a sense of referencing of other times. You get a sense of referencing antiquity in the architecture behind. So it's very aware of its time and place in the world. There is depth, there is empathy, and there is flow. Now, the Renaissance moved north across Europe, but then, of course, we get the Reformation, which is a period very much like today, where there was a focus on authenticity, on stripping back of ornament, on stripping back of characters and stripping back of metaphor, and an intolerance, actually, about other ideas. And what you see in this period is fascinating because in artwork of the period, such that it exists, in churches and so on, mostly stripped away, but what you find is that churches move from people standing in free formation, looking at the altar, to people being regimented and sitting down and looking instead at the pulpit, where the word of God is proclaimed. And you'll notice here how many words there are on this painting. It's as if the painting only exists, the images only exist to support the words that are emblazoned over the top of it. You'll also notice there's not really a sense of a whole in this painting. It's lots of different scenes, a sort of set of abstractions, if you like. And then we get the Baroque period, which is a period of sensuality, a period of mixed emotions, a period where it was okay to feel joy and melancholy. And you see depth emerging in art. You see, in this canaletto here, the passing of time as the clouds move over the canal. You see in music that the passions in Bach and others, where it's possible to feel, sort of have conflicting things. So loud and soft and high and low and fast and slow. All of these things come to the fore in music. And it's a sense of awe that comes in this period with the palaces, great palaces of Europe and St. Peter's in Rome. So you get, sort of a more sense of the whole again. But then we move into the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment sought to shine a light on people, on things, on questions. It was felt that there was no question that could go unanswered, couldn't go unanswered, and you get enormous change in society because there's replication in manufacturing, and you get in this, of course, painting here, the French Revolution. And some important features in this painting that give you a sense of what it was like to be around in the time of the Terror. You get here a sense of abstraction. Notice the different bits of spolio, the architectural abstractions in the background. Notice there's no real sense of the whole. It's all trying to tell you something, trying to impart some sort of way of thinking. You get words appearing. Yes, the Tree of Liberty, so signs and symbols, signs of the pickaxes and the red cap of the revolution, signs of the flag, and perhaps most tellingly of all, the all-seeing eye of truth that looks down upon you. Now, how many times have you heard recently the eyes of history are upon us? Well, the all-seeing eye of truth is significant because in schizophrenic patients who have left brain dominance, they tend to paint, when they have psychotic episodes, if you ask them to paint what they're seeing, you get a single eye being painted because there's a sense of paranoia that goes with the left brain, that the right brain, because the right brain's not functioning properly and feeding the world as it really is to it. So a sense of abstraction and ideas about the thing become more important than the thing itself, as you get in all of these left brain periods. And then we move to the Romantic period. And the Romantic period, there's some important features I'd like to point out in this painting. This is Caspar David Friedrich. And in the Romantic period, there were many, many paintings of nighttime, of dreams. You see it in music as well, in Chopin's nocturnes and so on. And there's this sense of ambiguity. Visual ambiguity is important and moving. And you see a sense of betweenness in the two women sitting at the front here, one with her arm around the other, looking out at the men, looking out at the boats. If the left brain does desire and wanting, the right brain does longing and yearning. And there's a clear sense of place in the Romantic period, in art, in literature, and in music. But then, of course, increasing mechanization, and we move towards the 20th century, and we get a flatness and a self-consciousness, and a kind of flatness emerging as never before in art and in music. And Schoenberg famously said, whose music I think is difficult to appreciate intuitively, some of it anyway, he said, how the music sounds is hardly the point. So again, ideas about the thing, the conceptualization of the thing, more important than actually how it affects you. Now, what I'd like to do is to bring you up to date, because what happened in the 1960s was that there was a brief flowering of the right brain. The right brain found a way through, not in high art and culture, but in popular culture, in fashion, in music, in television, of course, and in advertising. And for about 40 years, we had a wonderful period where metaphor and humour were very much to be enjoyed and on display. And what I'd like to show you is an ad from this period, from mid-1980s. And I'd like you to look for all the right brain features that I've been talking about. So what we're interested in here is a clear sense of place, a sense of betweenness in the characters, language used not as a a tool of communication but a mode of expression. You'll notice that the accents are very important. So anything that the right brain understands, gestures, movements, intonation, all of those things, and accents. You'll notice that the whole thing is a metaphor for something, and of course it's referencing something else. Gosh, you must be on the edge of your seats wondering what this ad is. So let me show you this ad and have a look for those things.
The water in Mallorca doesn't taste like what it ought to.
No. The water in Majorca don't taste like what it ought to.
The water in Mallorca doesn't taste quite how it should.
Majorca!
Mallorca?
Majorca!
Mallorca?
Hi, Dale, any dangerous some refreshment in here?
Here you are. Get your laughing gear in there.
Oh, golly. The water in Majorca
What's that?
don't taste like what it oughta. Gosh. The water in Majorca don't taste like what it oughta.
She's cracked it. She's only cracked it.
You're absolutely wrong.
Heineken refreshes the parts what other beers cannot reach.
Oi, Del, any danger of some refreshment in here? Accents, intonation, seeing the world as it really is. So we move on, and I'm going to show you an ad from last year, and I'd like you to look out for some left brain features. I think they'll be very apparent. You'll notice abstraction, you'll notice devitalization, you'll notice an emphasis on the word, so the word getting in the way. You will notice there'll be a very self-conscious feel to the ad. It's got an air of menace to it. And also very unilateral communication, me at you. Rather than a drama, we're getting a lecture. Okay, so let's have a look at this.
Look, everybody wanna go and talk that. At the same time, gotta walk that. Better yet, run, go, hit a lick, divvy up with my homies, and we do it all again. They just wanna find a way out, find a way to put a little food up in their mouth. I could get a verse and then go about my business. You ain't even see it coming, can I get a witness? When I go to sleep, I only dream about my other dreams. If you want it, gotta get it, gotta live it, no condition back.
Highly rhythmic, a sense of me at you, literally ends me pointing at you, and a sense of flatness throughout, as you probably noticed. And these aren't the only, I could have picked many ads to show this. So if you look on top left here, you'll notice the abstraction. You only see bits of people, bits of mouths, hands, signs, symbols, flatness, words appearing. Bottom left, you've got things appearing from the right visual field, which is the left brain's preferred field of view. Emphasis on things rather than people. On the right, you'll notice ads from 20, 30 years ago, a sense of depth, a sense of betweenness in the characters, a sense of connection, a sense of place, a sense of history, actually, and accents and, of course, humour and metaphor. So does this really exist, or is it just a figment of my imagination? Well, I set out to test a hypothesis and see if we could objectively measure it. So the first thing I did was to look in perhaps a bit left-brain style, to categorize some features of what you might expect to see in left-brain advertising. Flatness, abstracted products or bits of people, hands, mouth, words obtruding over the ad, unilateral communication, so me at you, voiceover or monologue, adjectives used as nouns, freeze frame effects, audio repetition, and highly rhythmic soundtracks. So these are things that I was looking for in ads over a long time period. And then the right brain features were a clear sense of place, a scene unfolding with progression, characters with agency that had voices, movement, expression, implicit and unspoken communication, so knowing glances, nudges, winks, all those sorts of things, dialogue between people, distinctive accents, a play on words or subversion of language, so not just using it as a tool to tell you something, but playing with it, set in the past, costumes and sets, or a reference to other cultural works, pastiche and parody, and music with melody. And what we did was we reconstructed Coronation Street ad breaks going back 30 years in the same week, and we analysed nearly 700 ads for these features. Do they have them or not? And they were coded up blind by someone I trained, and they had no knowledge of the year in which these ads aired. And what we find is something really quite dramatic, in that it was in 2006 that we see a massive swing away from balance or even slight right brain dominance in the ads that air on TV. And you get a highly left brain kind of style of advertising starting to emerge. And this, of course, predates the global downturn, which is often, one of the hypotheses for why advertising has become more, more activation focused, I suppose. So this is a marked change in advertising style. And so just to show you some details from that, what we've lost: implicit communication, distinctive accents, play on words, and scene unfolding with progression, music, cultural references. Most worryingly of all, I think, pastiche and parody, the sense that we're not referencing culture anymore, that we're just sort of holding a mirror up to it. These things have disappeared in this period. And in their place, by the way, characters have too, as I've talked about in other presentations. So fluent devices, as I call them, so characters that are commonly used, like the meerkat, I suppose, a remaining example of characters being used across a long campaign, but also context. So you're not you when you're hungry, Snickers, those sorts of scenario fluent devices that involve people connecting with each other, they've disappeared in the same period too. In their place, we have increased rhythm, monologues, voiceovers, words obtruding on the ad, adjectives used as nouns. The left brain loves things, so it turns to this nounification of everything. And then flatness has increased as well. So to double check this analysis, I looked at 100 ads in the UK. I did the same in the US and took them from System1's ad ratings database. We test every ad that airs for emotional response in the UK and the US on television. And so a random sample, and the same pattern certainly exists today when you take a random sample of ads. It's not just Coronation Street where you're seeing this, both the US and the UK. And I also looked at a random sample of YouTube ads here on the left, and you see it's even greater difference here between left brain dominance and right brain features. Now, if all this could be just put down to a matter of taste, and it doesn't really matter, does it? Well, it's just a matter of taste. But it's much more important than that because it has a bearing on effectiveness. What we do at System1 is we measure emotional response in a very scalable way to advertising using the work of psychologist Paul Ekman. And we measure emotional response to how people feel, and we use it to generate, from that raw emotional response, a star rating that gives you the ability to adjust share of voice to predict and better explain market share growth in the following period. Now, Peter and Les have recommended, and there's an update in their latest work, a kind of rule of thumb, a principle that for every 10 percentage points of excess share of voice, you get half a percentage point in market share gain in the following period. And this is the breakfast cereal category, and this is TV excess share of voice. And what you find is that model that I've just described, which is the vertical axis, does actually explain, you'll be glad to know, Peter, does actually explain actual growth in the following period, but only to a certain point. That's just looking at the quantity, if you like, of advertising. When you factor in emotional response to each of the ads for each of these 12 brands, and you up or down weight share of voice accordingly, you get a much better explanation of market share growth. And in fact, it shows that both quality and quantity, quality measured by emotional response, but quality and quantity of advertising together are much more predictive of what's going to happen in the real world. So back to our story. So if we take our star rating here as a sort of predictor, if you like, as a share of voice amplifier, a measure of creativity, what we find is that ads that have more left brain features tend to perform poorly on this emotional response measure and therefore market share gain. Whereas ads that have a high proportion of right brain features, and there's this really strong and significant relationship between right brain features and emotional response. If you don't have very many of these, you're not going to get a very good star rating and unlikely to drive market share gain. So let's take everything together and let's just look at those features. The left brain features are down the bottom on this sort of more effective to less effective as measured by emotional response, and the right brain features at the top. They fairly interestingly sort of map into two different buckets. And then if we overlay that with the historical analysis and the prevalence of these things over time, what you find is that the right brain features, which are more likely to generate share gain, are declining, and that the left brain features, the least effective features, are becoming more common. This change, of course, helps to explain the decline in creativity and the crisis in creativity that Peter talks about, and will no doubt talk about again in a moment. This mental shift towards an impetuous left brain way of thinking helps to explain the rise in short-termism. And, of course, it helps to explain the decline in advertising effectiveness, which takes its first dent in 2006. As Bill Bernbach said, all of us who professionally use the mass media are the shapers of society. We can vulgarize that society, we can brutalize it, or we can help lift it onto a higher level, which is precisely what he and his agency in New York did, of course. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about how we got here and what we can do about it, then why not buy this book? Because as Adrian Holmes, who created The Water in New Yorker, D&AD president, very kindly writes on the front cover, if the advertising brain has stopped working properly, maybe this is the repair manual. Thank you very much.